Welcome to another episode of the Data Journey, where we talk to brands that I feel are doing exciting things with data. Today, we're talking about insight self-sufficiency with Marshall and Jaden of Weaver Leather. Marshall is the Chief Information Officer and Jaden is the data analyst. These two were involved with the deployment of a data ecosystem at Weaver Leather. And the problem that they faced is that, like many of the organizations that are now jumping in and succeeding with data in the second wave, they have a very storied history. So if I have any of these details wrong, both of you please jump in and correct me. But give us a little bit of a high-level history of the organization. And is this founding date of 73 that I found online correct?
That's right.
Well, that makes this the 50th year.
That's right. Yep.
Congratulations on a half century.
Yeah, thanks.
What has that, just from a business standpoint, before we get into data, just high level, what has that 50 years been like? Where did this company start and how did it get to where it is?
Yeah, interesting history. The roots are a shoe repair shop just down the road from where we are now. And Harry Weaver was the founder and had a knack for fixing about anything. So his shoe repair store turned into a, hey, can you make me this? Can you fix this? Which slowly developed into a line of equestrian products. So horse halters and reins and those kind of products that once he initially was making them custom one-offs for customers and started to figure out that, hey, there's a potential market here. Let's make some stock product and see if we can sell this. And again, interesting characters were involved. The actual first employee that worked with Harry still works at Weaver today, but them just trying to figure out how to sell things to customers slowly spanned into a full line of products for the equine industry, which oddly enough spanned into the arborist industry, which is another space that we're in. It seems like a misfit, but it's all tied back to those roots of manufacturing. So developed year over year over year into the building that we're in now. And if you look at this from an overhead picture, you can see about 50 add-ons that have happened over the course of those 50 years of us expanding little bit by little bit and developing into a sizable company that we are today, serving 6 different industries through a lot of different markets. So pretty interesting history that I won't get into the details of, but here we all are today, 50 years later.
So you're saying that there is physical infrastructure that shows that year over year growth, and I don't want to use the term sprawl because sometimes it has negative connotations, especially when I use it with data. But you're saying there is a physical, you can look physically and see that growth, that incremental growth in the physical structures of the organization.
You can. So a number of years ago, we had some overhead photography done, drone footage flying over, and we actually built a 3D model. And from that, you can see just discolorations in the roof line. And you can see like the oldest sections to the newest sections. And there's sort of a stripe that highlights almost like rings of a tree that shows that like physical growth over the years.
That is amazing. So transition now into the data journey. What has that been like for 50 years? And what was the data sprawl like before you tackled this data ecosystem project?
Yeah, that was eye-opening. Probably a little worse than what we would have predicted when we were going through the interview process as we started down this road. So like probably a lot of businesses, heavy reliance on Excel, and there were spreadsheets buried in folders among folders that a lot of these had been reproduced for literally 20 plus years. Like this is a report that we look at and we develop this every month or whatever the frequency was. So a lot of in-house Excel sheets sitting in files, but also over the years with the advent of all these online services, individual users that would have a certain data source that they would have a login and go pull data. We use JD Edwards as our ERP, so a lot of data in there, at least that was somewhat consistent. But we were surprised to find how many unique sources of data that we had throughout the company. When we did the interviews, I think we all took a guess and missed by, more than half of what we thought the number of sources would be.
Yeah, and that is pretty typical in the data audit process when you're conducting those data audit discussions and the interviews with the end users. And you have a very large, so you've already mentioned that Weaver Leather serves many, many markets and does so in a very broad way. So you have retail relationships, you have D2C, you're on Amazon, you have not just different segments and markets that you go after, some by pet, some by category, but also you have a very wide net that you're casting that's all the way from brick and mortar retail up to many of the what people would consider the more cutting edge of the D2C platforms.
We do. So it's a complex business, and that also created a complex data footprint because each of those individual, we call divisions, we treat it all as one business. It's all operated from this facility, but the divisions are distinct and they serve different markets. And so what we found was maybe in the pet space, they use these data sources or they're accessing these endpoints. Supply might be totally different. Equine might be totally different. So while it is one company, we had these pockets of data that only certain people had access to or knowledge of. And in some cases, that's okay because that data may only be relevant to them. But in other cases, there were opportunities for shared data that could have been useful to the whole organization. So that also revealed itself through this project, and it's become a real opportunity to consolidate that and give visibility to everyone.
One other complicating factor is that you also operate both, if I understand everything correctly, you operate both as a wholesaler. So there are items that you are ordering and that are coming into your flow for which you just resell. Then there are others, some of which are the same, that you transform into final products. So you have a robust manufacturing process. This is not just reselling things. You have a lot of manufacturing that has to happen in between the inputs and the outputs.
That's right. Yep, we do. So in our supply division in particular, use that as an example, a lot of that is raw materials that we resell to other manufacturers that might be making similar products to what we are. They get making whatever. So leather or nylon goods we're just distributing those products to them for them to convert. But we're also using those same raw materials in our own manufacturing to make the products we sell to any of those in industries, be it equine, livestock, pet, whatever. So yeah, there's a lot going on here between manufacturing, distribution, warehousing, and all the channels and markets that we serve. Turns into a lot of complexity and a lot of data.
And Jaden, you volunteered bravely as a new hire when I had first met you, I think, to tackle this project among some others. The data was a primary focus for bringing you on. And what did you see when you first arrived? What were the hesitations that you encountered in the organization as this project started to take shape and then get real momentum?
Yeah, so when I first started, we were primarily working out of just our JD Edwards database, and then through our other sources as well, such as Vix was one that we were hitting on. We were also hitting on some of our other freight data, but there wasn't really an easy way to combine the two together. There was more so of this will do this will do that, but it was never joining those two together. We were never able to, or we could, but it was very challenging to join data sources together. It was very time consuming to make sure everything would fit together, everything worked together. But as time has gone on here, it's been nice to be able to combine those together.
So the breaking down the silos and bringing the information in one place so that it could be blended and utilized in total, not just in isolation. Marshall mentioned the use of spreadsheets, Excel. What about the dashboard? So during the data audits, we identified, like Marshall talked about, many, many data sources. I remember from some of the data audit discussions that a lot of the end users were going straight to platforms, were going straight to dashboards. And I would say probably 80% of the users, that was as far as they went. Then there were some of these power users, if you want to call them that, and some of them were, by the way, some of them are Excel wizards, but they had moved beyond that to the stuff that Marshall was talking about, using things in Excel, putting together spreadsheets, workbooks, things that functioned as prototypes when we talk about the next step in the data audit and in the deployment of the ecosystem. But back to the hesitations, how many of those dashboard users were hesitant to move away from something like the Google Analytics dashboard itself to something that was not just Google Analytics, but that blended the other data with it, that added value? Was that a tough sell at the time?
I'll say, I'll maybe turn that a little bit. I think the harder sell has been some of the Excel-based users, because I think we found that some of those that were into some of those other platforms that were maybe a dashboard user were maybe a little more savvy or maybe a little bit more open to exploration. And some of the harder converts have been those that have been like, hey, I get this report and I've used it for 20 years and I know what I know from that. And it's been a little bit harder to get them moved over. But I will say, those that we've gotten ingrained into Power BI in our case, once they're over that sort of fear and newness hurdle, the ability to see, well, a couple things. One, it's refreshed daily. A lot of these Excel reports were maybe monthly, certainly not all, but we had a bulk of reports that somebody had to put together monthly, and that was your monthly report. That was your view, your snapshot of what had just happened in the previous month. So as many of those as we've converted, you can look at it every day and not only look at the same metrics you used to see, but drill down to the detail and unravel what's really going on or what's driving this change or that change. So some of those that have even been a hard sell, once they're developing a level of comfort, have definitely embraced it and taken off. And I'm not sure I could name a name that said, I'm not going to use this. I don't like the new way. I'm going back. So there's been positive adoption, but like I said back at the beginning, I think some of the less data savvy were the harder sells.
Interesting. Okay. Well, at some point you did commit to doing this as an organization, which is a big step. And you then, with our help, went through all the data audit process, identified the many data sources, the many more data sources than anyone expected. The next step was cutting through that to figure out what was going to be immediately useful. And I think this is a step that you and some of the others that we've had on the data journey so far, that this differs from some of the standard advice of just grab every single thing from every single source that you have, put it in one place, and then allow people to start to use the pieces that are going to be useful to them. You took a much more surgical approach. We found and discovered many, many more data sources than we're ultimately connected to. You've mentioned JD Edwards, which represented 80% of the data itself, total data was coming out of that one system. But the other 20%, we had to whittle it down to about a dozen other sources that were immediately necessary. And I know that you, in your own roadmap, have now had additional data sources added that you continue to grow this. But how has managing these upstream connections, once this was set up and you identified what data was going to flow into your data warehouse, how has managing those connections gone?
So yeah, you mentioned JD Edwards being our 80% of our data, and I definitely say that's true. The other type that we're running into is mainly APIs, things such as shipping APIs, the Google API, we use Shopify, so the Shopify API. All of those we have to get the credentials for, make sure they stay the same, make sure we're allowed to connect to them. And for the most part, it's been a pretty simple process with using most of those. Recently, Google did the big change to GA4. That's been a pretty big process that we had to change. And even the Shopify API changes from time to time. Some of just the layout of the APIs change, which do cause some upstream issues for trying to go all the way down through the data ecosystem. So those are the main things we've run into.
How you mentioned the UA to the GA4 transition with Google, and we've also seen similar issues when organizations change ERP systems or they add something. You don't just have the new connection that you potentially have to build a connector for or to manage that connection. If everything about that connection changes, you also then have to reconcile your existing data model with whatever those new changes are going to require. How much of that have you had to deal with in the last 12 months with this system operating on your own?
So we just swapped over most of our connections to GA4 from UA. I think they've now officially deprecated all the endpoints for Universal Analytics for us. For the process, like you mentioned, there's multiple things that go into it. It's not just setting it up in the back end. a lot of the data, how it's reported and recorded, is also different between the two. So even simple things like sessions have changed quite a lot, and just trying to get used to how do we use what we previously had with what we currently have now with the GA4 endpoint, and how to make the two go together has been an issue we're trying to get through.
Have you had to abandon the idea that you can reconcile them and go in an entirely new direction? Or have you been able to piece together some insights from UA with some insights from GA4, so you've got some continuity going back historically? Because all of this affects historical data, which historical data is the primary source that you're going to use for any kind of predictive modeling. And if you've now effectively severed the past because you have two different kinds of data structures and models, how much of it have you been able to actually reconcile?
I didn't know. You can chime in too, Jaden, but not a ton. So because they've changed not just the data structures, but the very way that they're attributing conversions, it's not directly compatible once you compare the cutoff. So you can still go into Universal Analytics, let's say for September, it tracked all the way through September. If you look at analytics, Universal Analytics data through September and GA4 data through September, they won't be the same as each other. So we've largely, Jaden has built so that the GA4 will give us a look back period to, I don't remember what that cutoff was, and then we'll have Universal Analytics prior to that. So what that will give us is, when I think of like quarterly reporting, next quarter, it's going to be exclusively based on GA4, while the prior quarter was still using Universal. And we don't want to see this giant contrast that's not explainable between, hey, what happened between Q3 2023 and Q4 2023. So we'll be able to retroactively run the Q3 reports against GA4 data so that we can get an apples to apples comparison. But we did have to compromise a bit on exactly how we were going to merge those two together.
Yeah, this has been a big issue for a lot of organizations because they depend, especially with D2C. And you've got D2C was a growing focus for this organization. This is a big problem that a lot of people are trying to solve. So it's interesting to see how you're going about it. How has the growth in D2C overall, separate from Google and thinking about some of the other online platforms that you're using, how has that D2C growth added complexity over the last year?
Well, you use the word sprawl again, but it has created significant sprawl. I mean, in the direct consumer space and within the Shopify ecosystem, they've got an add-on for everything. So as we've built out our own sites and use these add-ons, well, in some cases, these add-ons will have their own backend data source, but sources like email, loyalty and rewards, reviews, obviously the Google thing, there's so many software as a service companies out there that they're collecting data that's useful for reporting. We've added, I don't know how many data sources we're up to, but I'm sure it's more than 12, probably more than 50 at this point, that the next thing pops up and we need another data source. Luckily, Jaden's gotten pretty quick at putting those together because of that sprawl over the last year.
Interesting. Jaden, what has been your biggest obstacle in creating new connectors?
It's probably learning, or I guess it'd be the EDA aspect of learning what's there and what we actually need. Things like Google Analytics can show the same metric a ton of different ways, and just understanding what we actually want to see with what is actually being given to us has been one of the harder parts for me.
And EDA being, for those who aren't great with acronyms, the exploratory data analysis, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. A very important step that many people skip. And you're saying that has been the key to navigating these different APIs with different documentations and different dimensions and metrics, and what you can ultimately pull from that into your ecosystem that's going to be useful for end users through the dashboards. Because that's the other part that we haven't even mentioned, is once you've changed the data model, now you have, and Marshall was starting to talk about this with a Q3 to Q4 comparison, but users also usually want to see what Q3 this year looks like versus Q3 of last year. And if you have a lot of these things built into the dashboard that depend on the data model, then as you change these upstream things, you have to change the data model, which then changes the end user experience through the dashboard. So as you grow the system, this problem grows with you. Speaking of systems, let's take a quick look at yours. I think so far this is the third data journey, and I think I finally got a diagram correctly done. You are on Azure, and I do want to talk about that specifically because that's unique in the data journey episode so far. You're on Azure. Your main system when we arrived was the JD Edwards. With that, you have, as Jaden has talked about, some of the shippers. You have additional online vendors, Amazon Central, Shopify. You have different digital marketing platforms and digital like social platforms. You also have individuals who are wanting to add things to this system. I think at one point, one of the data audits, someone said that they kept getting the same PDF by email every week or every month. And even that was something that was considered. I don't know if that has since been integrated, but that can be grabbed just like anything else, usually through an API, and then put into this Dockerized, containerized, and this is Jaden's world over here on the left, the Azure resources that have the Windows compute with the Postgres database, where all of those upstream sources are blended into one unified model, which is then broken out and prepped for all of the Power BI dashboards that you're connecting to. I think some users like Jaden have direct database access, so they don't have to go through Power BI to access the raw data. Jeremy, I think, would be another example of that. But is this an accurate picture of the data ecosystem still?
Yeah, I mean, maybe you'd be more qualified to answer that, Jaden, but I believe that captures it, other than, of course, the volume of that in that API third-party data bucket. But I know that's just a representative example. But yeah.
Yeah, that is definitely an abridged set in your case.
Sure.
But the core system centralizes information from your primary ERP, from all of these external third-party platforms into one Postgres database that the majority of end users interact with exclusively through pre-built Power BI dashboards. You then have some additional users who are building Power BI dashboards along the way, and then some even further, what I would really consider the power users like Jaden or Jeremy, who can go directly to the database itself.
That's right.
Okay.
Yep.
How has being on Azure Cloud lived up to your expectations? Because did you have other cloud systems prior to this deployment? And if so, anything that was comparable in this size and scale? And if not, how has that new experience been versus on-prem?
Yeah, nothing to scale. We actually did have an Azure cloud that was mostly a little test round to see, if we wanted to use this or move that way. So we had a little bit of data there that we would play with, but nothing to this scale. And the experience honestly has been really good. I mean, we had a learning curve. Some of this technology stack was new to us, and an environment of this scale and making sure that we were managing it appropriately. So there was a learning curve, and we spent some time on security, and we definitely hit a few bumps with timing. We had, all of our refreshes running at the same time. A lot of detail things that were really just growing pains. But honestly, it's been stable. It's been easy to navigate once we found our way. It's worked really well. And to this point, we are under our expected cost for managing this. As the data grows, I'm sure eventually that spend increases along with it. But so far, we are under what we forecast for what the expense would be.
Well, that's a nice thing to be surprised by. Usually it goes the other way. I've heard a few stories. I know there are now some controls in place, but I've heard a few firsthand horror stories of excess resource usage that resulted in wildly over budget costs.
And frankly, give you guys some credit for that. That was through, your team helping us forecast what to expect for cost. And I'm sure we built a little bit of cushion on top so that we didn't have that unpleasant surprise, but helpful to have that experience to give us a little gauge of what we should expect.
Well, and credit should be given to Tim Chaffin for his expert consulting advice in navigating the entire Microsoft cloud resource system. I think my memory is that when we priced out originally for your specs to the different cloud providers, that Amazon was the most expensive. Google Cloud wasn't really a viable option at that point. And Azure has a bunch of benefits because it's tied to what used to be Azure Active Directory that's now Entra ID, which made user control a lot easier. In a big organization like yours, that's really important.
Yep,
but
that's right.
Tim's ability to cut through the pre-canned list of things that the typical sales, like we just got on their website, just put in a form, fill out, got the typical cold, not warm sales call to us to figure out what was needed. And my memory is that even the low end price that Azure gave was considerably higher than anything that you've actually experienced. And I think most of that was stripping away parts of the system that were just canned and provided that did not need to be there. And that I for sure did not have the expertise to look at that list and say, oh yeah, you do not need this, this, and this. And someone like Tim, who was able to come in and who from experience standing up these systems could very quickly just trim the fat, I think that has gone a long way in your recurring costs and controlling your recurring costs. It
has. That very first stage was a bit intimidating because you do get this bucket of services and tools and software and associated costs. And we really didn't have the knowledge or experience to know what we needed. Is this right? Is this required? Are we doing the right things here? So, they do a nice job of presenting the data, they being Microsoft, and making it fairly easy, but those decisions about exactly what you need, maybe not so easy. So yeah, very, very helpful to have his expertise.
Has there been anything else that's really caught you off guard, maybe a negative that's caught you off guard about managing a data ecosystem?
I won't say big, but maybe Jaden, you could talk about some of the update timing and some of the non-refreshes that we had. These aren't huge issues, but maybe worth noting.
Yeah, so we had a bit of a collision with the Microsoft maintenance time. So some of our pipelines would try to run at the same time as Azure was going on maintenance or an update was getting pushed out. And that would cause some failures to happen with their data warehouse system that we had. So we had to work around that. But I feel like there hasn't been many things that have been bad with from our experience at least.
And you're notified of pipeline failures?
Yeah.
Yeah. How are you getting those notifications?
I get them on Teams. We have a sensor set up to notify me on Teams if something goes wrong.
Yeah, that's a great system. Well, this is a question I think for Marshall, because you're integrated into the C-suite, what has been the biggest win since you stood up this data ecosystem according to leadership?
Yeah, I had to think about this. I mean, a very generic and not very exciting example that I'll use anyway is just insight. I mean, there's so much information that we can get that we either couldn't get before or it was really difficult. And I'll maybe use an example of an easy one is freight. So our freight system was its own thing. And we had freight data in JD Edwards where it was applicable, but where we would lose it is customers that had earned free freight, say, or free freight plus discounts maybe. We really didn't know what that was costing us, not specifically, not attributed order by order. So that's just one small example of brand new insight that we were able to look and say like, wow, that's either better or worse than what we expected. And these are some changes we can make accordingly. But I'll list a few others that have been pretty specific wins. One was we had worked with a consulting group to help us be better at pricing, to maximize price that we could get in the market. And they were very sharp data analysts at the end of the day. So we were from them and sort of replicate what they were doing to gain all that insight to help with planned pricing and able to get essentially the same information in a very complex manner to help know how far you could go with pricing. So that was a nice opportunity to replace a consultant. And the other that I'll mention is some of the automation. So I mentioned a lot of us being spreadsheet heavy and the work that had to be done in some cases, let's say monthly reports that were developed in Excel. Well, we met with those teams, had them show us those reports. And Jaden was able to reproduce those data sets using Power BI that's now on an auto refresh schedule. So I mentioned earlier, not only did we take away the effort that was required to produce those, but we've expanded the insight and been able to give you that data on a daily basis. So those have been some very obvious, like, wow, this is a nice win and a big step forward for us.
Yeah, that's amazing. Jaden, what has adoption been like of this system across the brand? Because I feel like many of these stories keep coming back to the punchline that you are at the front of these efforts. What have you seen as the adoption across the brand? And how do you feel that's shaping the brand's direction?
Yeah, so I think with this one, it's definitely a current work in progress that we're working through. We found that people that do start using it, they love it, and the ones that can dig into it they really do enjoy using Power BI more so than just the Excel spreadsheets. It gives a good ability to drill down into data and actually dynamically get insights on specific KPIs and specific other data points that we're looking to see as a company. You can really see a lot more in one spot. There are some that do really like to dig in with Excel though, so it has been a little bit harder to get everybody on board. So we are still working as we go.
Have the efforts been pretty uniform across it, or the adoption, not the efforts, has the adoption been pretty uniform across the brand, or are there pockets of the brand that are leading much more than others? What have you experienced there?
I would say there would be pockets. Okay. I would say there would be pockets, but there's definitely some outliers with that. There's some people on different teams that might be using it more so than others. But I'd say it kind of starts with one person might find something useful, share it with someone else, and then all of a sudden everyone's using it in that department. And we've just had some slower spots with that, but I feel like over time we'll develop more to that.
Marshall, it sounded like you had some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, and similar to what Jaden said, but what I was going to do was take some of the blame for that, because I think if anything, when I look back through this project, the way that it's been rolled out and presented to the company, I would think that through again from the beginning. I think in some cases I'm trying to decide how to phrase this, but pulling some people in probably too late, not expanding it evenly across teams. Like in a lot of cases, we were like, let's solve this one problem and we'll tell those people that know about that problem. Sorry, I'm getting some noise there. So we were, and at some points rolling it out by like, these people like this report, let's fix that report and then we'll tell those people. And I think what I would do if I could do it over again was pull in teams and say, hey, equine sales team, here's this new tool. Let's talk about, talk about the way you use data and how we're going to roll this out to you and help you. So I think it is in pockets right now, although we are continuing to expand. But I think part of that is just the way that we rolled it out in a sort of almost needs-based.
So you're putting out fires versus strategically thinking through how to best clear this hole.
And I will say our new view is let's be more strategic about how we move forward. Again, calling this a journey is the right term because it's report sprawl, which we've done, and that's been generally effective. But then you get to a point where it's like, I no longer can find this piece of data because we've made this group of reports. So then it's, okay, let's reorganize and make sure we know what's where and consolidate some things. But then it's also, how do we appropriately roll this out to the user base at a pace that they're comfortable with and getting a big enough group involved? So we're getting better at that, but it's certainly a work in progress. We're learning as we go.
But you're saying that doing that as a group by department, you feel has been the effective fix for this.
It has because then we see some like data champions within those groups, and maybe somebody is a little more data savvy or a little bit more courageous, and they unlock something that they tell those other people about. And if they've all been presented and have access to that same group of reports, that can spark more interest in that other group. So rather than serving, hey, small group, here's this report you used to use, giving them the tool set and letting them experience it for themselves and talk among themselves has built more engagement, I would say.
Versus going individual by individual, need by need.
Yeah.
That's great advice for people, because even in the data audit discussions that we did early on, those are one-on-one. They're equivalent to more like a qualitative interview. And what you're describing is more akin to a focus group.
Yeah.
So it's great to see that you have found that approach has been more valuable as you roll this out to the broader audience, broader user.
And I'll add on to that a little bit. I think continued training is important, and we're developing a little bit of a curriculum to do that again. But we started to do is bring in these sort of larger groups, and we'll show them the tool. And maybe we'll have an example of, hey, we're replacing this report with Power BI, but Power BI is not just that report, it's this, and then we expose them to that. Let them go away. They spend enough time to know that, like, hey, there's more here, and I'm curious, and I've been able to do this. Then we bring that group back together and talk about it again, but at a deeper level, and show them how to really dig into filters and really how to pull insights out of that one piece of data. So I think it's been helpful to let people find it, or let people get exposed, play around a little bit, develop this list of questions in their head, and then hit it again to let them get a level deeper. So again, we sure don't have it figured out, but those are some of the things that we've found through this process.
That's awesome. Well, let's talk about where you're going, because you've gotten very far in your journey, very successfully. You have gotten to this point with very little failure compared to a lot of other projects. You've been very successful along the way, even though some of these efforts, it sounds like you've learned how to refocus them. What does this mean then for the future? So you have this system, it's totally internal. This is our model. If people don't understand that our model is to hand this over, you were told that right in the very earliest statement of work, that this will become your intellectual property. What we have is a turnkey backbone built on Docker, Python, a couple of key pieces of the tech stack. But once it's deployed, when we forked over the GitHub repo to you and we modified it to deploy the V1 of the data ecosystem, at that point, it's all within your control. What has that required from a team standpoint? I see Jaden is still around. That's a great sign. But team and composition, and then technology beyond the ecosystem itself. You've talked about learning and training. So a good example of possible technology would be an LMS, like a learning management system.
Yeah, I mean, I guess several things there. And Jaden, you can sure chime in when I'm done. But we haven't changed the technology stack a whole lot from the beginning, other than adding, a lot of additional data sources. And part of it, this is pretty nascent. Like we're still finding our way. We haven't unveiled a need for specific new pieces of technology so far. And as far as team, we're very lean. I mean, Jaden he's the only person in the building with a title like data analyst. He is building the data models. He's the tech resource for sure. And then we've empowered the team to use the insights from Power BI to help them make decisions and help them to see data better. So we don't have many isolated people that are a data source or a data resource within the company. We've empowered a lot of different people to be that. We do have one sales resource who historically that role has been to produce some of these Excel reports and some of this monthly reporting, and it will still be that, but we're going to train that user into the Power BI tool set. And instead of them doing sort of very manual recreation work each month, it's going to be help pull some of these insights out. And hopefully we can develop them into someone who can produce an ad hoc report out of the Power BI tool set if there is a need like that. So the team that's very specifically related, very lean, but it's been workable. And as this develops, maybe some of that changes, but we've been able to get some great value out of it with the team that we have so far.
Jaden, how many users through Power BI do you manage?
I want to say we're in the realm of 30s.
30s, yeah, 30 plus, 35.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too.
So Jaden's been able to manage 30 to 35 end users on the same tech stack for a year while greatly expanding both the number of API connections and the dashboards that are being provided to this team. It also sounds like there's been some ongoing training and there's been some strategy.
Yeah, and in some of those roles we certainly share. Like as far as user management, that's offloaded from Jaden. That'd be in our administrator's role, and then a lot of the training I have done with Jaden's help, and we will have another resource in our IT department. We are one short. Unfortunately, one of our team members passed away from a bout with cancer. I don't want to get into that deep, but so we're one person short, and that person that will re-add will also participate in some of the Power BI, like on the glass level understanding and training. So there will be one more resource that has at least partial responsibility for some of that work. But as far as all the back end report development and pipeline development and Python work, that's all Jaden.
Yeah, and to be clear, when I was talking about managing the Power BI users, I should have been clearer in my terminology. There is both the access component, which I'm assuming that's what you meant, is being handled through the IT department.
Yep.
But then there is the, how are we managing people's requests and people's, they find bugs or they think they're bugs because the numbers look different than they've always looked to them before. But then as Jaden digs in, he figures out it's not actually a bug. It's just correct now. 30 people, that's a lot of activity to manage as an individual. And obviously it sounds like you have about 2.5 people tackling this problem in total. But small team has been able to keep this system running for more than a year now. Yeah, that's awesome. I asked this question to everybody that's been on this so far. What has been the hardest lesson learned while progressing in your data journey? And I'd like both of you to weigh in on this.
You go first, Jaden.
Okay. Well, I mean, for me, what first comes to mind is the data governance aspect of the whole thing. Making a change upstream can cause a lot of issues downstream. You would think just changing some simple variable names or just very small minor changes, even to numbers, integers, things like that, but they all do have a massive effect throughout the entire ecosystem if it's one of the core data sets that you're looking at. Because you looking at it, it's like these simple changes that really can add up to cause heaps of problems, and that happened to us in our early stages of this.
Yeah, and maybe I'll switch to the more human element. I think short of like what Jaden described from the technical side, I think the probably the hardest part and maybe the most eye-opening has been, we talked about this already, but the adoption in some cases has been more challenging, and the managing the expanse of this, like how to manage the production of reports, how many reports, who can see what, like how do we bring people in? That was, I don't think I planned well enough. Like when we did all this, we're like, hey, this is awesome. We're just going to roll this out. It's going to be great. And there's more to it than that. So I think reviewing the way that we introduce this to users and bring users up to speed was a bit eye-opening.
Okay. So it sounds like that is related to Jaden's issue, which is governance, that just the management of this system from a technological standpoint, that has not been very difficult. It sounds like that's been quite easy. I think a great deal of that, having worked on training with both of you in particular throughout this process as we deployed the system, I think a lot of that is the personality of both of you. And Jaden, your skill set you have the data analyst title, but I would stack you up against any of the data scientists that I work with. And so some of that technological ease is a result of your people.
Well, I appreciate the comment and certainly agree. I mean, Jaden's ability to just figure this out and tackle it has been awesome, and surely has made our journey smoother and easier than expected. He's been able to do a lot, and for one person in this role, and as much as he's been able to output, has been certainly a huge contribution to the success of our project.
But that also means that Jaden has a very high truck factor, and we're back to the need for the governance. So what is the path to the next 50 years, and how does governance, since we left on that, how does that fit in?
Well, it's just become obvious as we go, and we've got a long way to go. We've been much more careful internally based on some of these mistakes about, hey, there's this new request for data, or there's going to be this change, or we're in the middle of an ERP system upgrade. So anything that we do, we now have an eye on what does that mean to our data network? What does that mean to our data warehouse? So we've at least got a consciousness of it. We're having discussions, but we don't have a fully fleshed out plan like we should. So that's something that we need to work on in this next year. And then into the future, when you talk about 50 years, it's going to be so much more data and sprawl and new sources. And back to that idea of making sure we're managing that well, because like I said, one lesson learned was just keep pumping out report after report after report after report. Well, suddenly it's become harder to use because is it that one that has a year-to-date sales title or this other one that has a similar year-to-date sales title but slightly different? So a lot of that is on us to just, and honestly, like so many things, we've learned better because we've done it in real time. I mean, all the lessons, and Luciano, you preached to us initially about the importance of this, but you never learn faster than when you've just made the mistake yourself. So some of it's been helpful for us to just see it and be like, okay, this is where we need to tighten up.
Yep. The best knowledge is experiential knowledge.
Yeah.
That comes from it comes from successes too, but failures, the lessons of a failure seem to stick a lot more.
Yep.
Jaden, technologically, what do you think the next 50 years are going to look like? Are you going to automate yourself? Are you going to make an AI clone of yourself and then just go on vacation?
That would really be nice. I would like to get into some of the more natural language processing aspects that have really seemed to expanded in the last little while, I'd say even months to the last year. The AI side of things, getting into this would be, I think, very powerful to do.
Have you played with any of the Chat GPT? It's not Chat GPT. I'm blanking on the title. It's OpenAI, but it's Microsoft's version inside of all of their tools. I can't remember the name of it now. But
Copilot.
And you have access to that through Power BI. And where your data has been so well structured and so well labeled and so well organized, the kinds of insights that can be surfaced using that are really powerful. Have you played with that at all? Do you have anything ongoing? Do you have any end users that are relying on that, the NLP that's built into Power BI right now?
I'll answer that in two ways, but I'm going to kick it back over to Jaden. So Copilot specifically, I have played with, and honestly, in Power BI, there are some really cool capabilities, particularly with, it's interesting how they're leveraging it, but where I've seen the most interesting capabilities are when, from a report that, let's say, Jaden has designed, I create a personal dashboard based on that. From the dashboard, there is a Copilot-based search functionality where you could type in something like, give me a line graph of sales of this particular SKU over this particular time period, and it will, and it's based only on the data set that you generated that dashboard from. But based on that data, it will generate that in real time, and it's right. So I've had some really neat successes with that, but on the flip side, I've been quite confident enough to roll that out to some of our users because I've also had it be wrong. And its wrongness is in its interpretation of the language that you use, but you need to have an understanding of the data, a pretty confident understanding of the data to validate what it produces. But it feels like it's so early that you give that a little bit of time, and that is going to be a powerful tool.
Well,
Go ahead.
No, you please finish.
Well, I was going to move on to some of the things that Jaden has experimented with. So if you had a question related to that, go ahead and I'll field that now.
Well, one of the reasons when we talked about early on in this project why we had picked Power BI is because of their ongoing update schedule. And it just one day, suddenly, the power of what was ChatGPT was just enabled throughout this tool.
Yeah.
The reports that we'd previously built for other clients, customers, those suddenly had this capability. Same with you. And during one of the training sessions, I had mentioned that this is one of the reasons that we opt for Power BI. The other is the user access. That is by far the main driver of that recommendation. The second is probably Azure cloud cost compared to the others. But the ability to let Microsoft continually innovate on a monthly basis to improve the product that you're using has paid huge dividends over the other platforms that are out there. So Tableau, Domo, any of those. They just can't keep pace with what is happening with Power BI. And you're right that this is early in their eventual product lifecycle. So 2 years from now, it's going to be pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and we've seen that. I mean, if it is monthly, they're changing it all the time. So they're paying attention to it. They're pushing to make this as good as it can be. They're introducing tools on a regular basis. So that has played out just as expected. Microsoft is definitely investing in this platform, and they're obviously invested in AI. So I'm sure in another year or so, there's going to be some really cool capability. The thing where I was going to pull Jaden into this is his experimentation with training some models and using some tools related to ChatGPT and some of the other models. So I don't know, Jaden, we haven't had a real concrete success, but some really interesting experiments that you've done, and we're continuing to try to play that out. So I was thinking of some of the indexing efforts that you had worked on, and some tools that can help at one point even trying to build reports against the data set from some of those tools. So if you wanted to talk to any of those a little bit.
Yeah, I've tried to do, I guess, a bunch of different things with it. I think there's a saying that 90% of AI projects fail. And so far we're in that range, but I've learned a lot through it that I feel like with just more time we'll eventually reach somewhere. We've tried to just bring all of our reports, like Marshall has mentioned. It's like, do I go to this report for that, or go to this report for that? So having a tool almost where a user could ask AI a question of which report something might be in, and then using the language to give them a result of where they could look, or even just a link, embed the Power BI report itself. Things like that have been things I've been trying to do with it.
Now, those are internal efforts. So these are models that you're doing the training on. Are you using Python for this?
Yeah.
Okay. And are these LLMs or these other approaches? What are you doing? ARIMA modeling? Anything?
It's the LLM models.
Okay. So you're approaching the AI approach that you're taking is very specific around language models.
Correct.
Okay. Have you tried or looked at any of the other forecasting? I remember that there were some of the parking lot items that we had discovered through the data audits, some individuals who wanted forecasting, things that might require machine learning but don't require an LLM.
Yeah, I mentioned a little bit with you mentioned the ARIMA model. Early on when we got our data warehouse up and running, it was a lot easier to run these type of models on our data. So I did experiment with that in the very beginning of time, but nothing's really came of it yet.
Well, the last few years have made modeling the next few years very difficult. I'm glad to hear that you're both on a great path with this system, but also as an organization in the marketplace. Anything else, any advice you have for those who are considering embarking down this same journey, which is, like Marshall said, it doesn't necessarily end?
It doesn't. And I will throw out one thing, and seriously, not because you put me up to it and not a paid spokesperson, but doing this as a paid for with help project was super valuable, because the idea of a data warehouse for us had been a back of mind thing for years. Hey, we should do this. And then it's analysis, paralysis about how do we get started? What data do we capture? What source do we use? A million questions. And inevitably we would just park it again. And it's so much to try to unravel. And not only that, had we actually got started, would we have done it right? You get a year down the road and I wish we would have done it this other way. So for us, the size of this organization, it was very valuable to make this a very public-facing project that the company was aware of, that we had spent money on and said, hey, this is something that we're going to do. And that just helped it. Just it being a project was such a catalyst for understanding for the rest of the company that I would strongly encourage. I've met with some other local businesses and unrelated topics, talk about getting into a data warehouse project. And that's one of the first things I bring up is make it a formal, proper project so that you can get the foundation done properly. From there, you'll never be done. It's an endless build. You'll develop some competencies. People will begin to embrace the reports, but starting right, I feel like, is very important.
And if you got somebody like Jaden, internal on the team, or you want to rely on individuals like us, it's something that can be done with a pretty lean team that you then own yourselves. So I appreciate both of you for taking the time to join me today on the data journey. Your story is wonderful for a bunch of reasons. I'm really excited to see what the next 50 years are going to be like. You are well ahead. I make a joke often about how well ahead you are with data compared to other businesses in particular. But I appreciate both of you taking the time to be on the data journey. For those who have been watching, thank you for getting to the end of this with us, and we'll see you at the next one.